from Mr. Morton's Barmy Book of Bonkers Bits.
Hello, welcome to Mr. Morton's Barmy Book of Bonkers Bits. I am Mr. Morton. Say, have you ever heard the story about the Granny Wars? No? Well, you see, whenever there's a new baby on the way, everybody has questions. Is it a boy or a girl? What shall we call it? What will it look like? Will it sleep? Will anybody sleep? These are the ordinary questions, the ones everybody thinks about. But there is another question, a much more dangerous question. That question is, what will the grandparents be called? You see, Sophie was expecting a new baby brother or sister, and one afternoon she asked, "What was it like when you found out I was on the way?" Mum looked up, and Dad looked over. They both smiled in exactly the same nervous sort of way. It was lovely." "Oh, yes," said Dad, trying not to make eye contact with anyone in the room. "Lovely. Mostly." Sophie frowned. "What does that mean?" Dad set down his mug and took a big breath. "You see, Sophie, when we found out you were on the way, everybody was delighted. There was hugging, cheering, crying, a lot of people saying they'd known all along, which they definitely had not. But what none of us were prepared for was the Granny Wars." "The Granny Wars?" Mum nodded. "Yes, the Granny Wars." Dad put down his mug and leaned back into a position that came before a long explanation. "You see, Sophie, your mum's mum, Lois, and my mum, Jill, well, those were your two grandmothers-to-be. And the funny thing was, they got on brilliantly. You see, some in-laws can barely get through a garden centre together, but Lois and Jill, well, they went for coffee together, swapped recipes. Once they spent a whole Saturday choosing curtains and came back even more cheerful than when they left. That's the sort of friendship we're talking about. So when they heard about the baby, they were overjoyed. They laughed, they cried, they hugged everybody twice. And then, at exactly the same moment, they both said, 'Ooh, I shall be Granny.'" There was a pause. Lois smiled, and Jill smiled back. And then Lois said very sweetly, "Really? I always thought you more of a grandma." Jill gave a tiny laugh. "Oh no, I can absolutely see you as a Gigi." "Gigi? Oh yes, very modern, very you." Lois folded her arms. "How funny! I was just thinking you had rather strong Nana energy." "Nana? Oh yes, or perhaps Gram." "Gram? Well, what's wrong with being a Gram?" Jill stared at her. "Well, if we're making suggestions, I do think you'd make a lovely Yaya." "Yaya? Oh yes, fresh, unusual, or perhaps a glamour." And that was how it started. Two women trying to hand each other every grandmother name except the one they both wanted. Next, it was the family WhatsApp group, one we've always had called Family News. And that night our phone started pinging, because Lois changed her name in it to Real Granny. And then half an hour later, Jill changed hers too to Official Granny. So Lois answered back with Actual Granny, and Jill came back with the one and only Granny. Well, Lois changed hers again to the Granny who called it first, and Jill changed hers to the Real Slim Granny. And that was the beginning. Then came the statuses. Lois wrote, "Some people just naturally radiate Granny." And Jill wrote, "In the end, the right name always finds the right person." Well, then that escalated into profile pictures. Lois appeared holding a mug that said, "World's Best Future Granny," and Jill changed hers to a photograph of herself in the garden with the words, "Not saying I'm Granny, just staying open to the possibility." And then came the memes. And by memes, I don't mean one or two harmless jokes. I mean a bombardment. From breakfast till bedtime. At first, it was just a few. A granny dancing in sunglasses. A granny holding a baby and giving thumbs up. A mug that said #1 Granny. But then it started getting stranger. A granny lifting weights. A granny sprinting in pink trainers. A granny with her teeth flying out while still somehow looking pleased with herself. And then the darker ones started coming. One with a granny shoving another granny into a lake. And in the end, we just had to mute the group for the next 9 months. But then came the presents. You see, at first they were normal. A blanket, a baby book, a teddy. But then everything started becoming branded. Lois started tying labels onto everything. "With love from Granny Lois." So Jill answered with tags sewn into things. "For baby from Granny Jill." Well, Lois bought a teddy bear bigger than the pram, so Jill bought one even bigger than that. Lois bought a silver photo frame with Granny Lois engraved on the back, and Jill brought a memory chest with little brass corners and a card inside reading, "For precious little memories, lovingly arranged by Granny Jill." So Lois bought baby grows in her favourite colour, and Jill bought more baby grows in hers. And so it went. On and on. They just kept buying, they couldn't stop. I still have bags of baby stuff in the loft we've never touched because there was just so much. And that's only the start of it. Then the fridge became a battlefield. At first, it was pies and casseroles. Lois filled the top shelves, Jill filled the middle shelf, and the bottom shelf was puddings. There was nowhere for milk. One said, Granny's biscuits, and the other one said, the real Granny's biscuits. Both were full. Both were excellent, and that was part of the difficulty. But then it stopped being helpful food and started becoming something much more dangerous. Bake-off food. Lois turned up with a Victoria sponge with Granny piped across the top in pink icing. Well, Jill answered with a lemon drizzle topped with sugared flowers and one tiny fondant rocking chair. Lois brought iced biscuits shaped like rattles, baby bottles and hearts, while Jill turned up with petit fours in matching pastel colours and a cake stand. Lois made jam tarts arranged to spell Team Granny, so Jill created a full 3-tier cake with little white booties made of icing and a tiny sugar banner reading, Safe hands, soft lap, strong biscuits. The kitchen smelt like a village fete, and I ate so much of it that I nearly put on as much weight as your mum. Oh, and don't forget the music, said Mum helpfully. Dad closed his eyes for a moment. Oh yes, the music. It started innocently enough. Lois sang a lullaby to the bump, and Jill sang one back. Lois added a second verse, and Jill harmonized. Lois turned up next week with a guitarist, and Jill responded with a string quartet. Lois arrived after that with a full band. Jill answered with a choir. A choir? Said Sophie. Yes, a choir. 4 women from a church, and one man called Dennis who looked absolutely terrified. But that's not the end. Then came the rehearsals, and the arrangements, and then came arguments over tempo. Lois said Jill's version lacked feeling, and Jill said Lois's lacked structure. Lois accused Jill of pushing hers to the back on purpose, and Jill said Lois was lucky to be included at all. But it didn't stop there. They took it into the recording studio and made competing records. Lois recorded Granny Sings for Baby, and Jill responded with Songs for Baby by Granny Jill. Lois said Jill was really only the backing singer in her own life, and Jill said Lois confused volume with talent. And did either record do very well? Asked Sophie. Well, no, not unless you count upsetting the neighbours, said Dad. Neither record made it anywhere on the charts, and that upset them both. So that was when things turned political, because if the music couldn't decide it, then clearly democracy must. But this was a terrible mistake. You see, there were rosettes, leaflets, tote bags, tea towels. Lois had Keep Calm and Call Me Granny printed on everything that would stay still long enough. And Jill had tote bags made saying, Make Granny sensible again. Lois began referring to herself, in front of the bump, as the people's granny. And Jill started saying things like, In the event of a granny situation, you know where to turn. There was a board in the kitchen that said, Vote Granny. And underneath were 2 columns. Lois had drawn a rose by her name, and Jill had drawn a teacup. But then came the debate. An actual debate in the sitting room, with 2 dining chairs dragged apart and folded ironing board in the middle serving as a podium. Lois gave an opening statement about warmth and instinct and pudding, whereas Jill made a strong case for punctuality, blanket folding, and locating Calpol in the dark. Lois said, The family deserves heart, and Jill said, The family deserves consistency. Lois said, My opponent means well, but she can be very rigid. And Jill said, My opponent means very well, but she's never once returned a Tupperware lid to its correct container. Then they campaigned. They canvassed aunts. They canvassed cousins. They approached neighbours. I strongly suspect one of them even spoke to the postman. And after all that, do you know what happened on the night of the voting? Nothing. Your mum and I sat down to watch telly and forgot all about it. It's true, said Mum. We had had enough, Dad said. There were ballot slips on the sideboard, a leaflet in the fruit bowl, and 2 campaign mugs by the sink, and, frankly, we just forgot. We had other things going on. The whole democratic process collapsed because we just wanted to watch a quiz show in peace. Well, this did not go down well. By this point, both of them had stopped being ordinary grandmothers and had become fully fledged populist leaders in cardigans. And then somebody, we're still not quite sure who, suggested it should be settled with a boxing match. Now, I know what you're thinking. This was not a serious suggestion at first, but within 2 days, Lois has said, Well, I'd like to see her try. And Jill had replied, I think we all would. So they started training. Wrist weights, stretching, a skipping rope, shadow boxing in the conservatory, and the trash talking stayed deeply, deeply well-mannered. I must say, you're looking remarkably spry for someone who needs to sit down halfway through the church raffle. Oh, how kind. And you're looking wonderfully self-assured for a woman who's been beaten by a fitted sheet on more than one occasion. Oh, I do hope your wrists survived the blanket folding. Oh, well, I hope that your top notes survived the lullaby. I'd stretch if I were you. I have, dear, repeatedly. Thankfully, in the end, boxing was judged too common, too sweaty, too vulgar for two women of their age. But by this stage, it was towards the end of the pregnancy, and things had got so bad that they decided there was only one way to settle it. A duel to the death. Pistols, 10 paces, at dawn. How did they get pistols? Sophie asked. Dad paused. Sophie, we've never found out. And to this day, I'm not sure I want to. But by then, your mum and I were not even part of the argument anymore. We were just trying to get through the last weeks of the pregnancy before you arrived without being handed a leaflet or being asked to choose between pie and casserole. And then, you decided to come early, and your mum went into labour. Well, suddenly everything became much more real. So we went off to the hospital, and while we were there, with much more important things going on, your two grandmothers were in the garden preparing to shoot each other over the title of Granny. At dawn they met. There was a case. Inside it were 2 pistols. There was a line scratched in the mud, and there was a handkerchief for the signal. Neither woman was smiling now. They checked their pistols and stood back to back. 1 pistol each. 10 paces to walk, then turn, then fire. Dad lowered his voice. And just as they began to walk, 1 step, 2, 3, the grass still wet from the morning dew. 4, 5, their coats flapping in the morning air. 6, 7, not a word, just a steely resolve. 8, 9, and then a phone rang. Both women froze. And for one wild second, each thought the other had cheated. But then another phone started ringing too. Lois fumbled in her pocket first, and Jill was already digging through her handbag. Lois answered. Jill answered. There was a pause. Then both their faces changed. The pistols dropped to the grass, the handkerchief blew away, and that was the end of the duel. The baby was coming. You were on your way, and suddenly there was no more war. No more campaign, no more debate, no more songs, no more granny wars. Just 2 women running for the car as fast as they could. At the hospital, they sat side by side, quiet. No scores, no competition, just waiting. Lois gripped the arm of the chair, and Jill was holding Lois's hand. Then a nurse came out smiling, and soon afterwards, they were allowed in. They walked quietly to the edge of the bed, and they leaned over. And that was the end of the war. Because there you were. Small, red, perfect. Lois made a sound, and Jill made exactly the same little sound. And then, you made one too. A wriggle, a snuffle, a tiny sound no one could properly agree on. Jill was certain that you said, ga. And Lois swore blind that you said, nah. And both of them were completely sure that you were talking to them. And so, that is how they came to have those names. Gaga and Nana. The war vanished there and then, and the name Granny was never mentioned again. Sophie sat still and thought about this story. So, I named them? Yes, sort of. So, the Granny Wars? Who won then? Mum smiled. You did, Sophie. Sophie slid off her chair and ran through to the sitting room. And there they were, Gaga and Nana, side by side on the sofa, watching TV. And Sophie snuggled in between them and gave them a big hug. And that's the story of the Granny Wars. I wonder what you call your grandparents. Maybe you could drop a comment down below and let me know. But in the meantime, I've been Mr. Morton, and you've been listening. Bye!
Thanks for joining Mr. Morton in his brilliantly barmy bonkers book. Spread the word to your wonderfully wacky friends. Subscribe for more silly stories. And remember, the world needs more magnificent madness!